e terei o imenso privilégio de moderar este webinar, contando com a presença de uma das maiores especialistas e mais reputadas investigadoras no âmbito da avaliação das aprendizagens. A professora Heidi Andrade, da Universidade de Albany, que nos fará uma apresentação intitulada A avaliação formativa é para aprender, não para testar. Mas antes de passar a palavra à nossa convidada, agradeço a vossa atenção para as seguintes informações. Este webinar está a ser transmitido por duas vias, o YouTube e o Zoom. Na transmissão via YouTube, não há tradução simultânea. Embora possam aceder à tradução simultânea se, na descrição do vídeo, clicarem no link que vos permite aceder à sessão Zoom e na qual terão acesso à tradução em português. Para quem está a assistir o webinar via Zoom e para terem acesso à respectiva tradução, há um ícone na barra inferior, um ícone com a forma de um globo e designado como interpretação, no qual devem clicar e escolher a língua para tradução simultânea. Estas informações aparecerão a par e passo no chat ao longo da sessão. Dito isto, quero afirmar que ter a Heidi Andrade connosco é uma dupla satisfação. Por um lado, como já disse, trata-se de uma das maiores especialistas em avaliação das aprendizagens da atualidade, com várias obras publicadas, as quais constituem referências fundamentais em todo o mundo no âmbito da avaliação das aprendizagens. Entre muitas obras, destaco duas, com a tradução do título para português, usando a avaliação para melhorar a aprendizagem, a aquisição e a autorregulação a autorregulação académica de 2017 e o Manual de Investigação em Avaliação na Sala de Aula de 2013. A outra razão é que a Heidi Andrade, que nos tem apoiado com simpatia e sabedoria, simboliza a letra e o espírito do Projeto MAIA. Colocar o conhecimento científico mais atual ao serviço das práticas da avaliação dos professores, de modo simples e efetivo. Não para propor e muito menos para impor qualquer modelo, que não existe nem nunca existiu, mas para cumprir com autonomia e inteligência profissional, afinal de contas, um quadro normativo que a todos obriga. Dito isto, e sem mais demoras, passo a palavra à nossa convidada e que naturalmente todos queremos ouvir. Olá, Heidi, a palavra é tua.
Hola, how are you?
I'm fine, and you?
I'm good. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Shall I go?
Yeah, we
All
are
right.
looking forward.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen then. I see we have almost 100 people here, which is lovely. I think 1,000 would be good. Let me move this out of the way so I can do this. All right, here we go. Ready or not? Now, for some reason, I cannot see anyone. I don't like that. Let me try this again, okay? I want to see people. Oh, we're over 100 now, 107. That's lovely. I would like to see people while I am presenting. But I guess I'm just not going to be able to do that. Okay, I will just begin. And someone will tell me when I need to stop or slow down, yes?
Yes, of course.
Okay, thank you. All right, here we go. One of my favorite subjects is formative assessment, so I am delighted to be able to talk with you about it today. I'm emphasizing in my title that formative assessment is about learning, right? A lot of people talk about formative assessment as assessment for learning, assessment not just of learning, but assessment for learning. It is not about testing. And this gives you a little hint that I'm going to be addressing some common misconceptions as at the very beginning. But first, let me share my agenda for the next hour and a half with you. I am going to introduce my learning goals because that's a central feature of formative assessment. I'm going to use several formative assessments during this 1.5 hour, 2 hour webinar. And that's one of them, is introducing learning goals, because people learn more if they know what they're supposed to learn, right? We have research on that. I'm not sure we really needed it, but it's true. Then I will make a quick proposal about self-regulated learning, which is my other favorite topic and related to formative assessment. You'll see about that in a minute. And then I'm going to address some common misconceptions about formative assessment. And I say they're common, but they're not common in the United States where I'm from. So the more I learn about Portugal, the more I realize that I need to talk about some common misconceptions, that are common, at least in Portugal, maybe other places. Then I'll ask you to generate some questions about formative assessment. Then I'll justify, define, and describe it, give you some examples of formative self and peer assessment from actual classrooms that I've worked in. And then at the end, we'll do another kind of formative assessment called a 1-minute paper. It's a reflection tool for you and a feedback tool for me. And then we'll have time for questions and discussion. So that's a lot, right? So let's just get going. First, my learning goals. By the time we are done here, you can expect to know that formative assessment promotes learning, doesn't just measure it, but promotes learning by providing high quality feedback for both teachers and students. I'm really interested in the feedback for students part, so that's what I'm going to emphasize today. But that's one slice of it you should know. You will also know that teachers are not the only source of feedback in the classroom. So when I say formative assessment provides high quality feedback for students, teachers tend to say, I can't give all my students feedback. You shouldn't. Even if you could, you are not the sole source of feedback in your classroom. Students are a plentiful source, and that's the third learning goal. Understand that students are useful sources of feedback, but only under the right conditions. And those conditions, which I will introduce, are clear criteria, a constructive process of critique, and time for revision. You will also understand that feedback is not useful without opportunities to revise and improve. So don't bother doing any of this formative assessment stuff if students and you don't have an opportunity to use the feedback to deepen learning and improve the work. And then finally, you can anticipate understanding how to use formative assessment to promote student learning in your classrooms. All right, so those are the goals. Let's go. But first, a few words about self-regulated learning. In order to focus for the next 2 hours almost on learning about formative assessment, you have to regulate your own learning. So self-regulated learners set goals, monitor their learning, and make adjustments to their approaches as needed. We have gobs of research that shows that self-regulated learners, including us adults, learn more, often lots more, than people who don't set goals for their learning, monitor whether or not they're learning, and make adjustments as needed. One major obstacle to self-regulated learning is the electronic leash, what we call my graduate students call it the electronic leash. Their technologies, their cell phones, their email, which might be open on behind this Zoom screen on your computer right now, a television, a radio, anything that creates a frequent distraction. Even if you're not using it, there's research that shows that if you can see your cell phone out of the corner of your eye, it creates cognitive load and it's a distraction. The human mind literally cannot parallel process. My undergraduates tell me all the time, oh, I'm just parallel processing. Our brains can't do that. What they do instead is they switch rapidly backward and forward from one thing to another. So all processing is shallow processing, and they don't learn anything. I'm going to invite you to put your distractions away. So to get your phone out of sight, to close your email if it's open behind your Zoom link, to turn off whatever distractions there are that you are able to control, and commit to focusing on this webinar. I do this in my teaching all the time. It works great. It's an invitation. I obviously can't tell you what to do. It's just an invitation to experiment. And some people, when I invite them to experiment with putting their cell phones away, especially, they get very anxious. So I promise you that I will give 1-minute text breaks during this webinar. And during those 1-minute text breaks, you can check your phone or check your email or see if the house is on fire, whatever you need to do. And then I come back. As a result, I give up maybe 2 minutes of time, and learners in my classrooms and in my webinars are more able to focus. So if you want to try it, and I hope you do, please put away your distractions and focus, and we'll have a little learning adventure together. Yes, I will send my PowerPoint later on. I just was checking the chat. Okay, so we're ready? Let's go. Okay, first I am going to define formative assessment, right? That seems like a reasonable place to start. Any process of gathering and using evidence of student learning to do 2 things. The first bullet is about what the teachers do, adapt instruction to meet students' needs. If you find out your students didn't learn what you thought you taught them, you reteach it in a new way. And the second part, which is my favorite part, supports students in making adjustments to their own approaches to learning and to their actual work. So one of my learning goals was to understand that there's no point in using formative assessment if your students cannot revise and improve their work. That's because a basic definition of formative assessment is that it's not formative if the information can't be used. Okay, so now I need to be able to see you. I need to be able to see the chat, actually. So I want to know how familiar you are with formative assessment as I just defined it, right? So there are lots of definitions of formative assessment, including some misconceptions about what it is. And I would like to know in the chat how familiar you are with this conception of formative assessment. So if you're very familiar with this way of thinking about formative assessment, that's a thumbs up. You can call it a traffic lights, that would be green, or a thumbs up, or you can just put a 3, 2, or 1. If you're somewhat familiar, that's a 2. If you're unfamiliar, that's a 1. I'm going to open up the chat and I'm just going to see all these numbers go by. And as the instructor right now, this will give me a sense of at least what you believe about your own understanding of formative assessment. So let me have a look. Just a 3, 2, or 1, please. All right, I'm waiting for more. I know there are lots more than 9 people here. Let me see some more. 3s, 2s, and 1s. Ooh, lots of 3s. Oh, somebody can't write. Somebody wrote that they can't write in the chat, but you have to be able to write in the chat to have written that. Wow, look at all these 3s, 2s. All right, a couple more. We're only up to 23 or 4 yet, so I'd like to see a few more. Let's get up to at least 30. Oh, there's someone with my last name. No surprise there. Okay, some 2s, some 1s. All right, this is typical, right? In any group of learners, you often have some variation. But this is telling me that I can do a pretty quick introduction to the basics of formative assessment and then get to my examples, right? So this was a formative assessment. It was a very little one, and it only tells me what you believe you know, but it at least tells me that I can go relatively quickly through my early slides, because many of you are pretty familiar with formative assessment as I just defined it. And those of you who are not will have an opportunity to catch up because I'm going to present these slides. I'm going to do it quickly, but I can Good. All right. That was really helpful. Okay. So we just did a tiny little bit of formative assessment. I'll return to that in a minute. What I know now is that I can do this next part relatively quickly. Oh, no, that's right. I'm going to do my common misconceptions first. All right. Common, at least in your part of the world. Apparently, a lot of people think that formative assessment means more testing. Oh, horrors. Not true, right? I crossed that one out. It is not about testing, as I put in the title. It is not about testing. It is so not about testing. It's about feedback, and feedback for teachers and students. So feedback that leads to revision for students and reteaching in a new way by teachers before any testing or grading happens, right? So as a result, it's about learning. And in fact, I do formative assessment all the time without administering a single test or quiz. By the way, you couldn't pay me to teach these days without using formative assessment. I will never teach without using formative assessment. It's incredibly powerful. It's natural. It's good pedagogy. A lot of my friends, colleagues say, why do we even use the word assessment? It gives people the wrong idea. I think that word assessment makes people think it's about teaching, but testing, but it's not about testing. It's about teaching. It's about really good teaching. Okay, so let's just set that one aside right now. Please keep an open mind. Formative assessment is just good teaching, and it's about learning. It's not about testing. I will point out that we can use tests in a formative way. That's my bottom bullet down here. We can use tests in a formative way in order to boost learning. And in fact, when I first learned about that, I got so excited, I decided that I was going to put a quiz in my class for my undergraduates and my graduate students, because wow, it's amazing how much they learn. But we're not going to talk about testing here. I wanted to pretty studiously avoid that during this webinar because of that misconception. We'll just have to have another webinar if you want to learn about that. Oh, but I did put an article about it in the resources, the references list on one of the last slides in this presentation. Is by Benjamin Bloom, the taxonomy guy. And so that's easily, freely accessible online. You can find it and you can learn about how to use formative assessment with traditional testing if you want. But there are all kinds of other formative assessments that are not tests, like the traffic lights, thumbs up, sideways down, 3, 2, 1 that we just did. I put a little video to Dylan William on YouTube if you're interested in looking at that later. I'm going to use a few more here today. I'm going to use something called What's Clear, What's Unclear with you. Exit slips or 1-minute papers, which I'm also going to do at the end, is a formative assessment. Rubrics can be used formatively. I do it all the time, especially in combination with self-assessment, which I will argue should always be formative. Peer feedback, peer assessment, always formative. Teacher feedback is formative assessment, right? So those are all types of formative assessment that are not tests. Okay, so hopefully you believe me by now that formative assessment is not about testing. It should happen before the test. Okay, another common misconception apparently is that formative assessment increases teacher workload. I don't know where that comes from. Maybe it's the assumption that the teacher is the only source of feedback in the classroom, which is not true. Absolutely not true. In fact, I argue even if teachers could be the only useful source of feedback for students in the classroom, they shouldn't, because students learn to think critically and to self-regulate and co-regulate their learning when you engage them in constructive self and peer feedback. That's the right conditions, right? So the self-assessment and peer assessment, peer feedback have to be taught. And so I'm going to teach them to you. What we know from research and what I can tell you from my own experience is that formative assessment actually reduces the amount of time that I have to correct student work. But it also ensures that my students are getting the feedback that they need to learn. Feedback is one of the most powerful influences on learning. People learn at least twice as much when they get feedback as when they don't get feedback, right? That's just natural. That's how we learn. And so formative assessment takes advantage of that. And it means that I'm doing a lot less correcting of my students' work, but they're still getting feedback and they're still learning more. I mean, you can't argue with that. That's one reason I will never teach without it again. Okay, one more misconception. Formative assessment makes test scores go down. I can't even guess where this one came from, because all of the research, the vast majority of the research, demonstrates that formative assessment increases test scores, increases grades, increases learning, and deepens learning while it's at it, right? So it's not just more learning, it's better learning, it's deeper learning. In addition, we have research that shows that formative assessment has a positive effect on students' motivation and on their self-regulated learning. In fact, in a lot of countries, including yours now, happily, because of these triple benefits of formative assessment on not just achievement, grades and scores, but also learning and self-regulation and motivation, people are calling formative assessment a policy pillar of educational significance. It's one of the most important educational reforms to come around in a long time, and it's having huge effects on student learning and achievement, and that's why I'm glad you're here. All right, I'm going to do a quick check of the chat. Someone will tell me if there's something I really need to attend here, I assume, right? Okay, I'll keep going. Okay, so now I invite you to generate questions about formative assessment, given my definition of it and what I just talked about in terms of misconceptions. It would be helpful to you and to me if you wonder a little bit. I ask my students to wonder a lot. So how about if you are likely to learn more if you ask a question about formative assessment right now, even if it is not addressed. Isn't that amazing? It's not amazing. It makes perfect sense because it means that you're thinking about the content and that you'll be listening for an answer. So there's research on that too. So I invite you to post a question or two about formative assessment and put them in the chat, even if they're in Portuguese, which I apologize. I still cannot read or speak. I know it's terrible. We will have somebody monitoring them, and then we will revisit them. And I will ask you at the end, was your question addressed during this webinar? And if not, would you like to ask it during the discussion? Okay, so take a moment right now and please post a question, one or two questions about formative assessment in, I guess we could put them in the Q&A, right? That seems like a good place for them. So go ahead, I'll be quiet while you do that. I don't see any questions appearing. I'm going to stop sharing and see if I can see what's happening. Okay, here they come. All right.
Heidi, já temos pelo menos duas perguntas.
Lots of questions. We have 175 participants, so I would like to see at least 176 questions.
Queres responder às primeiras que estão em inglês?
Oh, I see we have a witness. Somebody's doing it with upper grade students and it works well. We can do it with younger students. I will give you some examples about younger students. Good. Here they come. Yay. All right, I'm going to wait for a couple more. Really wonder. You can even write, I wonder. It doesn't even have to feel like a question. You can just be wonderful. Get it? Oh, there we go. All right, great. I'm going to keep going. Please keep your questions coming. Even if they don't get addressed right away, they are likely to be addressed as I go along. And we know from research, even if they're not addressed, you are going to learn more just from being wonderful. Okay. Oh, here's your first text break. Ready? Go. I'm going to time you. You can check your phones, check your email, check that the house is not on fire. Go. All right, time is up. Please put your phones back out of sight if you use them. Consider closing your email, and I'm going to carry on. Okay. For those of you who put a 1 in terms of your familiarity with formative assessment, it's time to pay attention because this is the basics. For those of you who put a 3, this is just a reminder, or you can take a little nap right now. No napping. I was just kidding. Okay, so formative assessment is not about grading, right? We already know it's not about testing. Grading and testing or scoring are summative assessment. Summative, it's at the end. Formative assessment is feedback for teachers and students. I represent it this way. Assessment can serve 2 purposes, at least. The formative assessment for learning is in green because the learning is ongoing, it's still going. Summative assessment is usually for accountability, reporting out, report cards. It's red because the learning has stopped and we're just measuring it and reporting it out. Some types of assessments, tests especially, serve mostly or only summative purposes, but lots of other things can serve formative purposes under the right conditions. So summative is about how did I do, right? I'm looking back on the learning, evaluating the quality of learning and work, can't improve, can't revise, and it's mostly that kind of assessment is for people outside the classroom to report to parents, to report to the state, whatever. Formative is how am I doing now? My work is in progress, is before, during, but not necessarily after a unit or a lesson. It's about feedback, it's about making improvements and revisions, and it's for people inside the classroom. One of the big misconceptions in the US is that formative assessment results have to be put on a grade file someplace. That ruins it. Don't do it. That makes it summative. So if it's formative, it's on work in progress and it's about feedback. And it's almost entirely for people inside the classroom. I focus on formative assessment because it's way more fun, but also because it promotes learning. It promotes academic achievements, higher test scores and grades. It promotes motivation even, and the self-regulation of learning. How can you not love formative assessment when it does all this great stuff? So that's what we're going to focus on in this webinar. This is my 6-word philosophy of assessment. Assessment is a moment of learning. Assessment is a moment of learning. A lot of us, we're not taught to think of assessment that way, especially people who have been teaching for 30 years. They think of assessment as summative. Maybe we should change the word, right? But it's basically just about good teaching and good learning. And if it's not a moment of learning, then we have missed an opportunity to teach well. Okay, formative assessment from a teacher's perspective is a matter of asking, how can I use assessment not merely to gauge student learning, like people who've been teaching with summative assessment for 30 years do, but also to help students learn more, right? Dual purposes. Where I think it gets really interesting is from a student's perspective, where we by using formative assessment and learning how to use formative assessment, students start thinking, how can I use this feedback to improve my own learning? Now, some of you are thinking, oh, Heidi, don't be ridiculous. Students don't think like that. But they do after after you get them used to it, right? So yes, it takes them, you have to teach them about formative assessment. So, and I'm going to show you how. So let's just get to it. Okay, 3 key questions of formative assessment from the student's perspective. Where am I going? That means what are the learning goals? What are the success criteria? Where am I now in terms of those learning goals and those success criteria? Like, is my learning good enough? Is my work good enough? Feedback, that's about feedback. And then how can I close the gap? That's about revision. Again, I'll say it again. I'll say it until you're sick of hearing me saying it. Don't bother with formative assessment unless students can revise. Don't bother with formative assessment unless you have an opportunity to somehow make sure that students learn, maybe by reteaching in a new way. Because the 3rd key question is, how can I close the gap? And if they can't close the gap, they're not going to close the gap the next time they do a similar assignment. That's not how learning works. They have to be able to revise that one. So here's how Sue Brookhart, my pal, represents the formative learning cycle. Where am I going is what am I trying to learn? Where am I now is how does my work compare to the success criteria for what I'm trying to learn? Where to next is what steps do I need to take in my learning in order to deepen my learning and improve my work? And we just go through this formative learning cycle. It's a natural cycle of learning. And so that's why formative assessment, once you get used to it, feels really natural to most of us, students and teachers. Okay, so I'm going to make a promise to you. I have a fun demonstration and a video about it, but I'm going to skip the video because I want to make sure that I don't run out of time for your questions, and also I don't want any technical difficulties. So I'll just make my promise, and then when I come to Portugal, we'll get together and I'll do the demonstration in person. Some of you have already seen it. Here's my promise. It's a bold promise. I promise if you incorporate assessment for learning, meaning formative assessment, your students will learn more, understand more deeply, get better scores and grades, and think and talk like experts. Holy cow, that's a pretty bold promise, and I can back it up with gobs of research. But what I'm going to do instead is share just a smidgen of research and then let you hear about it from students and teachers' voices. Okay, how does formative assessment work so well? It works by revealing what counts. That's the where am I going. It works by providing feedback from students themselves, their peers, their teachers, others, technology, maybe even AI nowadays, although you have to be careful about that one. Be a critical consumer of AI, and students too. I'm teaching my students how to use AI for feedback. Critically use AI for feedback. That addresses the where am I now question. It works by providing opportunities for revision and improvement. Yes, I'm saying it again. That's closing the gap. And there's even research that shows that it motivates learners. This shouldn't come as a shock because students feel better about doing the work if they know where they're going, they know where they are now, and they know how they can close the gap. The students who become like learned helplessness kind of students are revived by formative assessment because they know what they're supposed to be doing and that they'll get feedback and they can improve. Right? That's got to be motivating. It shouldn't be a surprise that this is motivating. It's not a silver bullet for motivation. It's not going to solve all of our motivation problems with students, but it does work and it has been shown in research to work. And I see it in my own teaching too. So the teachers that I've worked with for well over a decade on formative assessment in their classrooms, especially arts educators in New York City, came up with what they called the mantra. And this is the mantra: what counts? Feedback, revision. What counts? Feedback, revision. What counts? Feedback, revision. They build their lessons about this around what counts, feedback, revision. Their students come to expect them to share what counts, make sure that they get feedback, and provide opportunities to revise. So for instance, one teacher in elementary school, like she works with little kids, Eileen Fox, teaches dance in New York City. She has this what counts feedback revision. So what counts is, this is right on her board in her classroom, right? So she carries this around wherever she goes. Look, this is a photo from her classroom. How do I do my best work? Clear criteria is what counts. Feedback, revision. What counts? Feedback, revision. What counts? Feedback, revision. Her students know that that's how instruction is designed in the classroom, and they learn to expect that this kind of formative assessment learning cycle in their classroom. This is what I do too, although I don't have my laminated thing on the wall. Okay, so that's just one example. There are many others. What we know from research, including some of the original research on formative assessment, is that if students are only given marks or grades, they do not benefit. Assessment feedback has been shown to improve learning when it gives people specific guidance on strengths and weaknesses. Feedback on tests, seat work, homework should give each student guidance on how to improve, and each student must be given help and an opportunity to work on the improvement. Again, when I when I share this with teachers, they say, I can't give my students all the help that they need. Don't panic. The teacher is not the sole source of feedback in the classroom. Students themselves, their peers, teacher, others, technology, AI, parents, teachers' aides, whoever you can drag into the process can be a useful source of feedback under the right conditions. So let's get to those right conditions. Peer and self-assessment. I'm going to teach you how to improve learning, academic achievement, motivation, and self-regulated learning with formative peer and self-assessment. Before I do that, I always have to address common misconceptions about them both. This is what I overhear people talking about when they think I'm not listening, but I'm always listening. So I hear them say, well, student self-assessment is pointless because students just give themselves A's or high scores. Furthermore, peer assessment is pointless because students just compliment their friends and insult their enemies. And as if that wasn't enough, peer and self-feedback is a waste of time because students won't revise their work anyway. Right? Right. Yes, absolutely true. If you think of self-assessment as self-grading, peer feedback as peer grading, they will give themselves A's, they will compliment their friends, they will insult their enemies, and they won't revise because you just made them do summative assessment, which they may not know the word, but they know it's about grading or scoring, and you're done when you grade or score, right? Right. That's what they will do. And that's why we have this misconception, because people think of assessment not as feedback, but as grading or scoring. However, if you think of it in a formative way, and for instance, design self-assessment formatively, so students are reflecting on the quality of their work, judging the degree to which it reflects the goals or the criteria, and then revising. You can think of it as feedback for oneself, from oneself, not a matter of grading. It's a totally different animal. And once you teach them how to do it, they respond in a totally different way. I promise. So let me share with you a little bit about how that actually works. Oh, okay. First, a little more definition. Self-assessment is task specific. It's about this task and it's criteria referenced. Maybe. It doesn't always have to be. I saw that in the chat. Don't always have to be criteria. Students can reflect on their own goals for something if they want. Self-evaluation is when they grade or score. Please don't. It makes me want to cry. As you can see, that's me crying into my coffee. Reflection is more general. It's about my personal strengths and so on. When I talk about self-assessment, I'm talking about formative feedback on a task, often criteria referenced. How it works just addresses all three questions. Where am I going? How am I doing? And what is next? I'm just checking my time. I'm good. Okay, so I'm going to share with you a video. It was made in the classroom of 2 art educators, but it's about a writing task. I worked with these 7th grade teachers, Jason and Emily, for several years before we brought the cameras into their classroom to make a couple of videos about self-assessment and peer assessment. And before I play it, I want to tell you that we did not prepare the students at all for the little interviews that we did. The reason they sound incredibly smart and informed about self-assessment and in a few minutes peer assessment is because they had been doing this stuff, this formative assessment learning cycle, for probably 5 months maybe before we showed up with the cameras in their classrooms. And so they really know what they're talking about. But we didn't tell them that we're going to interview them. We didn't tell them. I have to tell you this because people always ask me, did you tell those kids what to say? We did not tell these kids. We didn't even tell them they're going to be interviewed today, much less the questions or the answers. But they sound wicked smart because they had been doing this for a few months. Okay, enough preface. Let's hear what they and their two teachers, Jason and Emily, have to say about student self-assessment.
When somebody is telling you, sometimes it's hard to take in, but when you tell yourself, it's sort of like, all right, let's get this straight.
You remember the word association game. I say blue, you say sky. I say sunshine, you say summer day. What if I said student self-assessment? Do you see students grading themselves? Each and every student gives themselves an A regardless of how much or little work they've done. But self-assessment is not about asking students to give themselves grades. By definition, that's summative self-evaluation. No, self-assessment means engaging students in a formative process in which they compare their work to clear criteria and determine how to make improvements. We believe that in all forms of learning, the opportunity to revise is essential. Self-assessment inspires students to take charge of the vision and revision process. In fact, research shows that students who use self-assessment methods learn more, earn better grades, and receive higher test scores. How can you create the right conditions for students to become their own most important resource in the assessment of their own work? This video will provide you with perspectives from students and teachers regarding the optimum classroom conditions for self-assessment, and will touch upon establishment of clear criteria with a rubric or checklist, supporting thoughtful self-assessment according to those criteria, setting aside time for students to revise and improve upon their work.
When I look at my work, I feel pretty good because I know that I can fix it and I know that I keep trying.
I can do everything myself, and that like I can see what I do wrong and how I can make myself better.
It was really helpful because sometimes you don't get your ideas straight and forget to include something. But when you look at the rubric, you know what you have to include.
We sort of have this philosophy in my class that if you are not at the level you wish to be, then you're not done yet. We start projects now in a very different way. We start them by really presenting and clarifying the criteria, the things that count. So my students now know exactly what their goals are and what they need to be immersed in. The self-assessments help them focus back into that criteria.
So, how do you do self-assessment? Consider a colored pencil technique. First, create a rubric with your students. Then, focus your students on specific elements of the criteria on the rubric by having them use a colored pencil to underline key words of a particular criterion on the rubric, and then look for evidence of having met that standard and underline it in the same color. In this example, for the first criterion, thesis, students underlined clear thesis in red, and then underlined their own thesis statement in red and considered whether or not it was clear. If not, they made a note to themselves in the margins that guided revision. You may guide your class through this process for each criterion. Once the essays have been thoroughly assessed, provide your students time to revise their work.
It's no longer just depending on me to tell them what to do. They're making the decisions themselves. The greatest discovery is definitely, wow, my students can improve so much from this. It's like an incredible discovery.
If you take your time for a self-assessment, it will make your work better because you have to take time to view your own work and not just like hand it in instantly. And then when you realize your mistake, you can't make it.
Check yourself and try to tell yourself what you did wrong, and also try to tell yourself what you did right, and so you're complimenting yourself. And you usually do this on like a writing piece, but you could do it on anything. It's always about improving now because you know you could do better. Like the next time you write something, you're always looking out for those mistakes. That does make me notice things that I wouldn't usually notice.
When I came into teaching, the most important thing for me as a teacher was to create independent learners. That feeds their entire life.
I say learning, you say growth. I say question, you say answer. I say self-assessment, you say a practical method of helping students identify strengths and weaknesses in their own work and revise accordingly. It is our hope that with these methods, your students may develop the skills they need as independent, self-directed, and lifelong learners.
So what's the point of having school if you can't make it learn from your mistakes?
Good question. Yay. All right. That was a great question. Let me keep going. Okay, so that was some an example of how we can engage students in really thoughtful, careful, constructive self-assessment in writing. That was based on my research. I've also done some research in math. So just for something completely different, I wanted to share with you what self-assessment might look like in a different discipline like math. So again, with middle school students, mostly 7th graders, I had students use criteria to assess the quality of their word problem solutions and revise as needed. And you won't be shocked to learn by now that they tended to do better work and receive higher scores after they self-assessed. So what did that look like? We worked with a teacher to come up with a checklist. We didn't need a whole rubric for this one. We came up with a checklist that emphasizes the process. Look at the leftmost column there for the criteria. Explain what is known, plan an approach, solve the problem, and explain the solution are all processes that the teacher really wanted to put in front of the students, but they pretty much completely ignored that, and they just looked at how they were supposed to check their own solution that I have in the purple block there. The criteria for checking their own solution included making sure they had the appropriate formula, or what the teacher called a let statement, diagrams with clear labels, all work was shown connected to the final answer, correct calculations, and so on. And so what the students had to do was they did their word problems, they sat with this checklist with the scoring criteria, and they checked their work. And if they discovered that they hadn't labeled the units in their answer, they went back and they did it. And as they were working on this, I'll never forget this one child, a young man who was sitting at the front of the classroom, said, "So, Mrs. Vandervliet, this is how you grade our work?" And she said, "Julio, I've told you this a million times." And the kid behind him said, "Yeah, but we needed to see it in writing. We needed to see it. We needed to do it to really understand it." And I thought, I'm going to write a paper about that, because it's true, it's brilliant, and it's part of why self-assessment works. Because if you're, as the teacher, if you're the only one thinking about whether or not students' work is right or not, why would you expect them to learn to think about whether or not their work is right? They don't. They just wait for you to do it. So when we teach them to self-assess, we also teach them to self-regulate their own learning, and they become more aware of what they should be looking at. They become more likely to revise. They become more likely to correct their own mistakes, right? All this dreamy stuff that we wish was happening with our students, and that we get so frustrated because how can they just be so mindless and make the same mistakes over and over? You start asking them to assess their own work, and that will change. That will change, at least for most of them. Okay, so this is how I've done it in math, and it worked. They got better at math. This is how I've done it, not how I did it necessarily, how a teacher and I worked with kindergartners. And these were very special kindergartners. So they were 5 years old. This was their first experience in school. And these weren't typical kindergartners. They were very low income kindergartners from a very poor part of a city near where I live. And I was working with their teacher, and she said, "Heidi, this self-assessment stuff is great, but I don't think my kids can do it. They're too young. They're too not in tune with school. They're not ready for school. They're not critical thinkers." And I said, "Liliana, you know your students better than I do, but I predict that this is exactly what they need, that they will benefit more from this, not less from this." And so she said, "All right, I accept the challenge." And we worked with the art teachers to come up with a kindergarten self-checklist of writing. So she taught her students that you're going to check your own writing, and they didn't coming into the classroom, to Liliana's classroom, many of these children did not know their own last names. They did not know the difference between the symbol for a letter and the symbol for a number. They did not know the names of the colors. They did not know that you start at the top left of the page and go right and down. I mean, they were really not ready for school. So some of it had to be put on this checklist. And so we came up with some of the criteria, typical criteria, like, does my writing make sense? But also stuff that they needed, like, did I start on the left side of the page and go right and down? Is my writing neat? Did I start my sentences with an uppercase letter? Did I write the words the way I learned them? There's a list of words on the board. And then she added, did I use punctuation? Even though Liliana says I never get to punctuation with my kindergartners in this school, that's always for the first grade teacher. But she put it on there, and then we taught them what the symbols meant. And we said, okay, before your teacher looks at your work, you check it. And they were amazing. They were just complete. First of all, they were like suddenly so empowered. It's like they got what they were supposed to be doing. They said, no, somebody had finally told them what they were supposed to be learning and working on, right? And that was novel for them. And they loved being able to check their own work. In fact, they checked so much and wanted to get it right so much that if they discovered they started a sentence without an uppercase letter, they would erase so much they'd erase little holes. They had little holes all over their papers from revision, erasing and revision. This is a unintended consequence of self-assessment in kindergarten, is holy paper. They were so engaged in learning about writing and revising their writing and getting their writing right that Liliana, their teacher, was absolutely amazed. Not only that, but they saw that thing at the bottom. Did I use punctuation? And Liliana said, don't worry about that one. You'll learn that in first grade. And oh, they were not having it. They said, no, it's there. We want to check it off. What is it? Teach it to us. So she did. And for the first time ever in this school with this population of children, she taught them punctuation, and they learned it. They learned it because they knew what they were supposed to learn. They had an opportunity to check their own work in terms of the learning goals, and they had an opportunity to revise, even if it meant erasing holes in their papers. So with very young children, this can work. With children who are pre-literate and maybe speak a different language, we use a lot of visual rubrics now. Lots of visual rubrics. I especially learned some great stuff from the art teachers that I've worked with, including the two you just saw, Maddie and Jason, Emily and Jason. Okay, so this is how we can do it with really young children. Even really young, really illiterate or pre-literate children can check their own work. And they are empowered and self-regulated and engaged by doing so, and motivated. We saw a lot of motivation in those kids. That's one of my favorite self-assessment stories. So that is self-assessment. Basically, it's part of every assessment cycle that I do. I introduce learning goals. I often co-create a rubric or a checklist, or at least I hand out copies or post it on the wall or something. Students do a first draft. They get peer feedback or self-assessment, depending on whichever I think is most appropriate. Then they revise. Then they get feedback from somebody else, and then they revise. Then I put teacher feedback with a question mark, because I have found that I don't need to give feedback as often. I can give feedback to the people who need it when they need it, and then they revise. And then I grade their student work using the same rubric or checklist, no fair switching, and they get higher grades and test scores as a result. That's my template. So you'll see self-assessment, brief conferences with teachers as necessary. You know who needs the extra help, and they may not know, so you have to seek them out. Okay, here's a little formative assessment. Everyone, please think, I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see you. Everyone, please think of an answer to each of these questions of what I have just presented, what is clear and what's unclear. And then somebody will cold call, meaning call on you, just name a name, and you will share either what's clear or what's unclear. Okay, it's very important when you do this that you give people time to think, right? Think time. So I'm going to be quiet for a moment. You jot down something that's clear, something that's unclear, and then I will just call on people and invite you to share. Andre, I'm going to invite you to invite people to share and then to do a quick translation for me, okay?
Okay.
Thank you. But first, some think time. Don't want to put people on the spot. Oh, I see they're putting it in the chat. Okay, if you prefer, you can just read 2 things that are clear and 3 things that are unclear. Does that work?
Okay.
Okay, but read them for me in English, okay? 2 things that are clear and 3 things that are unclear.
O que ficou muito claro foi que o feedback é essencial e fundamental para a aprendizagem dos alunos.
No, do it in English. So I mean, everybody can read it. So if you do it in English, then I can hear.
Let me see.
Feedback is necessary.
Formative assessment is for self-regulation,
Yeah.
Learning.
Yeah.
Feedback is very important.
All right. So that's 2 things that are clear, and I'm ecstatic that those things are clear, because those are central to the argument that I'm trying to make here. That's good.
And
okay, something that's unclear.
Unclear.
Yeah.
Let me add that that also clear that formative assessment is not testing.
Yay! Okay, good. All right. Phew. I'm glad that came across. Okay, what's unclear?
Unclear.
Yeah.
Is not clear that feedback is giving for all students for the same task.
I'm not sure I understand that. Say it again.
Let me try to rephrase.
Okay.
It's not clear that feedback is giving for all students for the same task.
Oh, I would think that pretty much all students should get feedback either from themselves, their peers, or their teachers on the same task, unless they're not working on the same task, in which case that would be silly, right?
Another thing that is unclear is that I will say, just like in the chat, it's clear for me the usefulness of feedback and revision, but not clear the summative part in the end.
The summative part doesn't have to change very much at all, right? So as long as the summative part at the end is still focused on the same content, the same learning goals that students were focused on during the formative part, you can still use a test, you can still come up with grades. So that's why I say rubrics are great for formative assessment, but also summative assessment. So you use rubrics to support really constructive self-assessment and peer feedback, and then you use the same rubric to give summative grades.
It is also unclear that the time that is necessary for doing the assessment formative cycle.
Yeah. Okay. I'm really glad that came up because I forgot to address it earlier. Benjamin Bloom, the taxonomy guy, discovered this decades ago. He was using testing formatively, and he was like sort of one of the fathers of all this. And what he discovered was that using formative assessment might slow down your progress through your curriculum at the beginning, but it speeds it up a lot around the middle, and you're not leaving any students behind, so that you actually don't lose. You can still cover the same amount of content in the same amount of time, but students have learned more. But in the beginning, you have to set aside time for some peer feedback in the classroom. They can do self-assessment. I almost always have my students do self-assessment at home as homework. So I don't give up much class time for that. But peer feedback, I try to make, at least in the beginning, to make sure that they are good at it. I set aside class time for that. And it's totally worth it. And it also helps me see what they don't understand so that I can give little instant mini lessons as they're working. And so my revision in terms of my instruction is happening while the same time that some of the peer feedback is happening. So yes, this does take time, but keep in mind that if you're just at the front of the classroom and you're talking and you're covering your curriculum, your students are not all learning. And at some point you have to ask yourself, what is the point of that? What is the point of that? If I know that this doesn't work as well as formative assessment works, why would we not devote at least some time to the formative assessment process? And it's really a lot more fun than just listening to me talk all day.
Another thing unclear is the opposition between formative assessment and final exams.
I don't see any opposition. I just don't. What I see formative assessment as is good teaching and learning, and final exams are just final exams. You know, you teach as well as you can, and formative assessment is part of that for many of us now. And then you give your final exam.
But we have to, we don't grade in formative assessment.
No, don't. Please
But
don't.
we have to grade the final exams.
Yeah, so do. No problem.
There is no opposition at all?
No. No, nothing. Formative assessment is just feedback so that you have learned as much as you can, developed your skills to the highest level you can before you take the final exam.
Do you want another thing?
Yeah, one more.
Unclear. One more?
One more thing that's unclear, and then we'll move on.
How long does it take before learners are ready to be formally assessed?
Does that mean the summative assessment?
I think so.
Yeah. That depends, you know, I can't give you a number. It depends on what you sense about whether or not they learned and whether or not they're ready. But the good thing is that you will know when they're ready. And using formative assessment, you see what they have learned and what they haven't learned. And so you will know when they're ready for the formal assessment in a way that you can't know otherwise. If they're just sitting there silently and you're not collecting any information about their learning, and neither are they, you don't know if they're ready. So I can't say how long it will take. But I can say it will take less time. Oh, Dylan William had a great review. I took that slide out. Did a review of the literature that showed that formative assessment actually doubles the speed of learning. Doubles the speed of learning? Really? I say that and do think that can't be true, right? Well, you know, a lot of people like me went in and looked at his calculations and his statistics and said, oh, maybe it's not doubling the speed of learning, but it's speeding it up a lot. So your students are likely to get ready to be formally assessed faster with formative assessment than they are without it. All right, so I'm going to stop there. I will just point out that we just did a formative assessment, right? So I, as the instructor, just got a sense of what I did teach well So you now know that formative assessment is not about testing. You know that it's about feedback and things like that. And it's about self-regulating learning. And I also got a sense of what you want to know and what you wonder about. Let me point out, I use this a lot in my teaching, because how many of us as instructors, as teachers, have ever said to a class, any questions? And nothing happens, right? Nothing happens. Like maybe the two kids in the front of the classroom whose parents insist that they get A's all the time might ask a few questions, but the rest of them just wait for you to move on. However, when I do what's clear, what's unclear, I get a lot more. Students are thinking more, and learning is a consequence of thinking. So that's good that they're thinking. I get a lot more good questions. We have a lot more good discussion, and it's formative assessment. And so they learn more. So I rarely say, are there any questions anymore? I almost always replace that with what's clear and what's unclear. Okay, so how are we doing on time? Oh my gosh, I have half an hour. Okay, that's fine. I'll be fine. I'm going to keep going because I really want you to hear from students about peer feedback too, because there are lots of misconceptions about that. Okay, now you can see my screen again, yes?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so we just did some formative assessment. Oh, before I go to peer assessment, everybody, please, here again, this is an opportunity to think and reflect. Just identify 1 or 2 opportunities to have your students self-assess. Surely you are more likely to actually engage your students in self-assessment if right now you think, you know, I could have them, you don't have to tell me, just jot down a note someplace where you'll come across it and think, oh, that was a good idea. I'll be quiet while you think. All right, I'm going to move on. If you couldn't think of a place in your curriculum where your students might self-assess, be sure to bring that up at the end when we have half an hour for questions and discussion, okay? Because I bet we can help you find a place to have your students self-assess. And they'll be thinking about the content like experts and learning more. A 1-minute text break. Ready? Go. I'll time you. You can check your cell phone. You can check your email. You can check the dog, whatever you need to check, the kids, the pot on the stove. And then you come back and you can just focus. It's blissful. All right. Text break is over. Please consider putting your phones out of sight and closing your email and coming back ready to focus. And I'll point out again, in order to help my learners regulate their attention, because attending school is mandatory, attention is voluntary. I love that saying. I just gave up literally 120 seconds of time, and I think it's more than worth it. It works great with my undergraduates, especially, who are addicted to their phones. Okay, now peer assessment. There are lots of common misconceptions about peer assessment, but they're based on actual experiences. So I know a lot of people, including myself, have been thrown into peer evaluation, peer feedback, peer whatever, that are not under the right conditions. And this comic, which I have permission to share, is an example of that. So I'll describe it to you. There are two girls, and they're looking at each other's artwork on the wall, Silene and Ruthie. And Silene says to Ruthie, "Your art just doesn't speak to me, Ruthie. It's all rather blah." Clearly, there are no criteria and there's no constructive feedback protocol here. "Your art just doesn't speak to me, Ruthie. It's all rather blah." Ruthie, who's annoyed, says, "Fine," and she stomps off. Silene says, "Where are you going?" Ruthie says, "To judge your art, Silene. That's what we do in a peer review." Silene has a sudden change of heart. "Did I also mention that the colors are beautiful? But it's too late." "Ah," Ruthie says, "the ugliness is choking me." So, yeah, I don't know how many of us have had this experience, but it's a lot, right? It's a lot. That's because this is peer assessment under the wrong conditions. And what's missing are criteria, some sort of standards to talk about. Like, what am I supposed to talk about when I look at your work? I need criteria. I need a checklist. I need a rubric. I need standards, whatever, something, right? But I also need a constructive process of critique. My favorite, which I'll introduce to you in two ways in a minute, is the ladder of feedback. But you can also use 2 stars and a wish, whatever. It's a protocol. So the ladder of feedback has 4 steps. They will be introduced in the video in a moment. So I'll just show you the others, which you're probably quite familiar with. 2 stars and a wish can be used with little kids. So 2 stars is, "This is what I really like about your work." And a wish is, "I wish that it was more whatever," or you might consider making it more whatever. You can also do glows and grows. Those are very popular with elementary school teachers here. "This is what I really like. This is what glows about your work." And grow. "This is how your work can grow." Okay, so that's 3 protocols: the ladder of feedback, 2 stars and a wish, and glows and grows. Very common protocols. And we have to teach them to our students. This does not come naturally, right? We have to teach people, because the automatic way of giving feedback is just to say what's either, if students are more focused on social goals, they'll just say, "Oh, everything's great." Like girls will do that. "Oh, your work is so good. I really like it. I wish mine was that good." Right? That's, my students call that blowing sunshine. Don't blow sunshine. Tell me how to improve my work and my learning. Or we go straight to critique, and this is what's wrong with it, and this is how you need to fix it. And that's so devastating that it's very hard to take that kind of feedback. So let's talk about what peer assessment looks like in this classroom under the right conditions from the perspective of the students.
Peer assessment is when you have a partner and you both look over your work and you say, and you both list the strengths and weaknesses and you fix it.
I feel like I'm next to a teacher, yet I can relate to my peer more because they're basically my age.
It was really helpful because sometimes you don't get your ideas straight and forget to include something. But when you look at the rubric, you know what you have to include.
Yeah, it helped me because I can see what I did wrong for myself, and then my peers and my friends or whatever, they can tell me, so then I can become better, and they can also become better from reading my work.
Through this process, my grading over the years has gone higher for all my students. And it's not because I'm being a generous grader, it's because the kids are so involved in the independent process of learning through peer and self-assessment that they are able to really raise their grade to where they feel it needs to be.
Before I was really doing self-assessment, peer assessment, I wasn't really clear to myself what I was teaching. So if I wasn't clear about it, how are the students going to be clear about it? And then when I had to really sit down and think about that, it totally changed my approach to teaching and what the children learn.
So, how do you do peer assessment? One way to do peer assessment is to use the ladder of feedback created by David Perkins of Harvard University. This method provides a process of critique that guides students to generate kind, thoughtful, and effective feedback. The ladder of feedback asks students to formulate their assessments in the following way. First, questions of clarification, such as, "Am I reading this correctly?" Second, comments on value. For example, what I think works really well is third, comments of concern, such as what I worry about is, and fourth, suggestions for revision, i.e., maybe this part would work better if you. Students may also base their feedback on the rubric you have created with them for the assignment. It is critical that as students confer, you walk around your classroom to monitor progress and ensure that the ladder of feedback is properly applied, that each student is receiving useful feedback, and as importantly, when your class completes the peer assessment process, students will have ample time to revise their work.
Vocabulary that I would try to teach before assessment just never seemed to stick, and now it's like sticking, and they're using it naturally in their speaking. It's amazing. They're able to take ownership of their own work. It's no longer just depending on me to tell them what to do. They're making the decisions themselves.
Their advice sometimes is clearer to their peer because it's not coming from an adult, it's coming from someone that's really on their level. They're a little bit more comfortable to hear the criticism from their peer, as well as the values and compliments that is in their work from their peers.
And I'm always amazed at what they're able to articulate. It's often better than what I would say.
Peer assessment allows me to understand other people's opinion about my work, and like, because after self-assessment you think like it's perfect, but then you have to make other people think it's perfect also. So you have to have a classmate or a group of people view it, so it can help you better understand other people's opinion, not just your own.
Actually, it makes me think, wow, I actually should change this. And in the end, my work turns out really good because of all the editing.
By trying assessment, you're going to learn what it is you're trying to teach.
The greatest discovery for me is how much power this gives my students as learners.
I tell you, I watch those videos and it makes me think my life was worthwhile. Okay, so peer assessment under the right conditions, criteria, standards, goals, something that students can talk about. And maybe you noticed that Jason, the teacher, said vocabulary is sticking now that he does peer and self-assessment. And that's because if you give them a rubric or a checklist with the criteria and say, give your peer feedback in terms of these criteria, they will start talking and thinking in terms of those criteria. So, you know, your writing doesn't make sense, or your math word problems don't have units. They're starting to talk and think like writers and mathematicians in ways that they don't if you're the only one doing the thinking about their work. That's why it works, because they're starting to internalize the standards of the discipline in really powerful ways and be able to think with and about them, even little kids. Okay, so please think for a moment about what you do in your own teaching or your own work, if you're in administration, where you can do peer feedback under the right conditions. So I encourage administrators all the time to use the ladder of feedback when they give feedback. It starts to create a culture of critique, of constructive critique in a school or in amongst a staff. I use it all the time with people who work for me, as well as in my classroom. You can also try it on your husbands, your children. People get pretty evangelical about the ladder of feedback. They use it everywhere. Waiters, waitresses, whatever. All right, I'm going to be quiet. You think about how and where you can use peer feedback in your own teaching practice. All right, for the record, that was 1 minute of thinking time. 1 minute. It may have felt like an eternity if you were just waiting for me to go on, but the truth is that we don't give students much time to think in the classroom. And when we do give them think time, don't call it wait time because that's what they'll do. Call it think time. They will actually use their brains in ways that they're not using when we don't give them think time. So get used to silence for 1 minute at a stretch and your students will learn more. Okay, so to sum up, formative assessment through self and peer feedback, there are 3 main points I want to make. One is the teacher is not and should not be the only source of feedback in the classroom. You see from the students in those videos that they are really empowered and really engaged and really learning by being a source of feedback for themselves and for each other in the classroom, right? So that's why I say, even if you could give all your students all the feedback they need, you shouldn't. You should teach them how to do it. And that means creating the right conditions where students can be useful sources of feedback for themselves and each other. For both self and peer assessment, that means knowing what counts and then a constructive protocol for critique, a constructive process for critique, and then time for revision. Time for revision, time for revision. There's no point in doing any of this unless there's time for revision.
Heidi,
Yeah.
can you show us the ladder of feedback?
Yeah, happily. Oops, there it is. This was taught to me by my mentor, to whom I am forever grateful. Should I check the chat? I didn't know until you just told me that if I check the chat, you see it on the screen, right? Is there something I should check?
No.
No, you just want to see it?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, since it's here, I will make a couple more comments about it because I love it and I think it's really important. And it's easy to get 2 things wrong about it. One is questions of clarification, which are not on either of these protocols, the other 2. You'll notice this is just about comments on strengths or what you value, strengths or what you value, and weaknesses or what can be improved. This one, the ladder of feedback, has that first step at the bottom. The first thing you do is ask questions of clarification about your peers' work, because you cannot give good feedback on a piece of work you do not understand, right? So people will just dive in, say, this is good, this is not good. No, stand back, read carefully, watch carefully, listen carefully, look carefully, and then ask questions. So when I have teacher in preparation, student teachers looking at each other's lesson plans in terms of the formative assessment, they should ask questions like, for what grade level was this designed? Are these typical learners? Do you have any students with special needs, right? All these questions that help you understand what you're giving feedback on before you give the feedback. That's a really important step, and I don't see it in very many protocols. It's very easy for students to confuse questions of clarification with concerns. So they'll say, do you really think this will work? There may be a question mark at the end, but it's rhetorical and it's a critique, right? It's not a true question of clarification. And so that's one of the things I really have to stress when I teach it, because I do teach the ladder of feedback. I teach it, I explain it, I justify it, I model it. I will even give students feedback on their feedback as I listen in on their feedback groups or pairs, or if I see written feedback, I'll say, that's not a question of clarification. Scratch that from the record, ask a question of clarification if you have it, and then you can move on to commenting on strengths of the work. Notice the language there, it says value. It's what I value, right? So I have to own my feedback. It's my perspective. It's only my perspective, and I have to own my lens, my perspective. So what I value about your work is, and I teach my students sentence stems like that, what I value, what I appreciate, what I really like, what I notice is, then they start to own the feedback. And it also makes it so it's about what I think, not something, in stone in your work that you can't change. After you comment on what you value about the work as part of the protocol, then you can talk about your concerns, not weaknesses necessarily, not things that are wrong with it, because it's just my perspective, it's my lens. But my concern is that this may be developmentally inappropriate for second graders, that the language may be too sophisticated or too simple or whatever, right? These are my concerns, and I share them with you as part of this constructive feedback. Very different than saying this is what's wrong with your work. And then if I can, I make suggestions for improving it. So you might simplify some of the jargon here by using different words, including this word, right? And so this is where actual improvements come out of the feedback, but it's still just feedback. Feedback, I teach my students, feedback is feedback, not a mandate. You don't have to take any of this feedback. You have your vision for your work. You know what the criteria are for it. The feedback is almost always useful to my students, but part of the reason that they are willing to consider it is because then they know they don't have to change everything about their work based on their peers. Sometimes their peers are wrong, right? So part of learning to be a good learner is to figure out what feedback works for me and what feedback doesn't work for me. So this is a very sophisticated protocol. I have used it with kids all the way down to 3rd grade. I imagine other people have used it with really small children, although glows and grows and 2 stars and a wish are more common with really young children. I love this protocol, and I'm happy to take questions on it in a minute. Are there questions right now that I should address?
No. We will take 2 questions at the end.
Okay. All right. Then I'm going to go back to where we left off. I just want to emphasize in this 3rd bullet, the bit about community of learners, which isn't just a group of students. It's because you're engaging, especially in the peer feedback. What I've noticed in my classrooms is that I end up with more of a community of learners, people talking about the content with each other, talking about quality with each other, and it sort of transforms the whole culture of my classroom in a way that I really like. Like I said in the beginning, I won't teach without this stuff again, because the learning is more fun, the learning is more effective, the teaching is more fun. Students come to class. Students do not miss my class anymore because this kind of stuff happens in the classroom and it makes it worth showing up. I have a community of learners and I value that a lot. Okay, one more formative assessment, please. I'm going to put this link, oops, not so fast. I'm going to put this link in the, darn it, I'll stop sharing, in the chat, and I encourage you to go to the link and let me get it. Come on. Wow, I got a lot going on here. Please go to this link and then answer. There are 2 questions and then 1 optional question. And the 2 questions are what, come on. What struck you? They're very open-ended questions. It's what struck you about this webinar. And the next question is what question, what do you wonder about? You know, what question is uppermost on your mind right now? And this will all go into a Google form anonymously, and then I can look at it. I always do this after almost every class I teach, almost every webinar I teach, because it gives me so much information about what my students learned, and if they learned something, if they didn't learn something that was really important to me, or if they think they learned something that I think is erroneous, that's problematic, but also what they want to know. And so what I do is I look at the 1-minute papers, I pull out the questions and things that they want to know that I think are most important, and I address them at the beginning of the next class. It takes a couple of minutes. So if a common misconception comes up, I make sure I address it. If they really want to know about something, I honor that because they put it in the 1-minute paper. I honor that by answering their question at the beginning of the next class. So there's fewer gaps in their knowledge and they feel respected and heard. Okay, so you got the link, right? You should click on the link and then go to the Google form and answer 2 questions there, and then there's a third. Is it a dead link, really?
No,
It
it's
works.
working.
Okay. It's not working for Samantha. And it's not working for other people. No, it's working for some people, but not others. Now that's odd. I cannot explain that. Please try it again. If it's working for anyone, it has to work for everyone. So I will put it in the chat again. I'll invite you to try it again. Maybe copy and paste it from the chat, open your browser and copy it in the chat, open your browser, paste it in the browser, and then maybe it'll work. Okay. While you're working on that, I will just point out that this is another kind of formative assessment. It gives you an opportunity to reflect on what you learned, which we know promotes learning. It gives me an opportunity to reflect on what has and has not been learned so that I can adjust my teaching accordingly. And I can address specific questions that specific learners have. So this 1-minute paper, and that third question, is there something you would like me to know? You wouldn't believe what students will tell you that they would never mention in person. That is really important for you to know. So I always use that in my 1-minute papers now because I find it helps me understand what my learners, my students are dealing with that I may not know otherwise. Okay, so, now a lot of people say it's not working, right? Do you see that in the chat, that it's not working?
Yes. Às vezes pode haver incompatibilidade de contas. Se tiverem mais do que uma conta aberta, pode haver estas situações e, portanto, impedir que abram o formulário.
All right, I am going to just share the 1-minute paper. I don't think we should fuss over it right now, although I would love your feedback. Perhaps you can just think about one thing that struck you, that stood out for you about this workshop, one question or concern that's uppermost on your mind. And then if there's anything you would like me to know, you can put it in the chat. But I'm not going to fuss with the technology right now. It's working for some people, but not others. So I can't explain it. But this is a 1-minute paper, right? It's based on Tom Angelo's work. One thing that it's sort of like what's clear, what's unclear, with an additional question. And I always use it at the end, and I find it very informative. Any questions about that?
No?
Okay. All right, then let's revisit your questions. So at the very beginning, I invited you to think of 1 or 2 questions based on my definition of formative assessment and the misconceptions I introduced, and then put them in the chat. So what I invite you to do, you don't have to go find them in the chat because you probably remember what they are. I hope you do. But think about whether or not those questions were addressed. And if they were not addressed, please ask. Please ask. Raise the question now. Now is the time to raise the question if it was not addressed. And if you say it in English, that's fine. If you say it in Portuguese, somebody will tell me what the question is. Okay? All right, I don't want to share my screen again, so I will just tell you that there is a list of resources here, including the websites that I either intended to introduce or did introduce today, and a bunch of articles that I think are useful, especially for teachers. They're not necessarily scholarly research-based pieces. They are written for and about teachers and teaching. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and ask you to tell us what your questions are at this point. Let's start with the hard ones first, shall we?
May I?
Yes, certainly.
There is a trend to use rubrics mostly or only for grading,
Shame. So sad. Such a
increasing
lost
teaching
opportunity.
workload. How can we use rubrics for formative assessment?
Okay, so you saw in the self-assessment where students were using the colored pencils, they were looking at the rubric. So each student had a rubric in front of them, and they look at it, and then they look at their work to see if the work reflects the criteria on the rubric. And that makes they don't say, oh, I give myself an A, right? They say, ooh, I really need to work on my sentence structures, because it clearly says in this rubric that my writing has to have correct sentence structures and a variety of sentence structures and use and good word choices and voice. And what I've learned from my research is that when you give students the rubric and ask them to self-assess according to that rubric, they will make pretty sophisticated revisions to their work that they wouldn't make otherwise, and they learn more and improve their work. When giving peer feedback, I always make sure that's one of the right conditions, right? That they have to have criteria, and those criteria can come from the rubric or the checklist. And so they're giving each other feedback based on that rubric. And so that's how the rubric gets used formatively. I also, when I give students feedback, I always base it on what's on the rubric. Right. And it's so much easier to give feedback based on a rubric, because otherwise I'm just trying to make it up all the time. It's like, what do I see here? What do I even say about it? Well, what I'm going to say is your references are not formatted correctly. Your annotations are clear and focused or unclear and focused. Your research questions haven't been stated yet. Where is your thesis statement? Where are the labels for your, right? So it's all about what's on the rubric. And that's how I use rubrics. In fact, I invented a rubric because I wanted to scaffold thoughtful self-assessment. And my first publication about rubrics from 30 years ago was about that, not about rubrics for grading. They're great for grading, but they're fantastic for feedback.
Thank you, Heidi. Another question, may I?
Yeah.
Should we use formative assessment information or data for grading?
No, never, not on pain of death. If you do, I will pretend that I don't know you. Right?
But
no.
why?
No. Because that's the important part. Why? Because it's not formative anymore. If you use formative information, like I say to my students, hey, write a draft of this, do a draft, do a practice volleyball serve, or do a practice as a goalie in the net, right? And I say it's practice, and then I grade them on it, and I put that grade in my grade file. They say, but that was practice, right? I was practicing it. I was learning. I wasn't ready. It turns it into summative assessment, and summative assessment is where the learning stops. The action in the classroom stops when you do summative assessment. When you grade or you score, the action stops. Students know that it's done, right? And so what is the point of trying? What is the point of feedback? What is the point of revision? I'm not going to revise. You just graded it. So obviously I'm done, right? That's why.
Thank you. I will take another question for bonus.
Yeah, well,
okay.
we have time, right? You ask questions until you tell me we're out of time.
The time is running very quickly.
Yeah, I know.
So I will ask you a last question.
Okay.
Let me see in the chat.
Or in the Q&A, there's a good one. What? Somebody... Go ahead.
$1 million question. How can we improve assessment, formative assessment practices with no changes in teachers' culture and professional culture of schools?
I will say just do it, right? So it would be wonderful and lovely if you had a cultural sea change, or if you totally changed how you taught teachers and professional development, but that's not necessary, right? So I teach in higher education, right? I teach at a research university. You don't even have to be a good teacher to get tenure here. I do this stuff because I love it and because it works for me, but I don't have to wait for any of my colleagues to do it. All I have to do is what I do in my classroom. Try one thing. And even if it's just using testing formatively, read that Benjamin Bloom article in my reference list. I'll send the slides. Even if it's just formative testing before the summative testing, you're going to be a better teacher. You can do it without waiting for anybody else to do it. And you can do it one thing at a time. You can just do what's clear, what's unclear. You can just do a 1-minute paper. You can just do self-assessment, just do peer feedback. And then if you start with one thing, then you'll decide, oh, that worked nicely. And my students responded really well. I'll try something else. I'll try something else. I'll try something else. And before you know it, you're doing what's clear. You're doing 1-minute papers. You're doing self-assessment. You're doing peer feedback, and everybody's happier and they're learning more.
And the final question is,
when do we get more of this? No, go ahead.
It's the last one, I swear.
Okay.
If I were a young teacher,
yeah,
what should be the most important advice to give him?
Figure out what your learning goals are. That might be a surprise, right? Because you thought I was going to say feedback, but you heard Jason, the teacher in the video, say, until I started doing all this, I didn't know what I was trying to teach. I didn't know what my learning goals were. I didn't know what my learning goals were for my students. So that's where you start, because if you start mucking around with the self and the peer feedback, but you don't even know what your learning goals are, you can't come up with good criteria. You can't come up with good tasks. You have to start, that's backwards planning. So you have to start at the end. What do I want my students to learn? And then work from there. Does that make sense?
Yes, a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
And thank you, Heidi.
Thank you.
For
It was
today.
my pleasure. My
It was
pleasure.
a great pleasure having you with us. Terminado este webinar, lembro que ficará disponível no YouTube com tradução para português e no site do Projeto MAIA, aliás, como todos os outros webinars. Resta-me agradecer à Heidi e a todos os meus colegas da equipa central, bem como a equipa da DGE que nos ajudou a realizar este webinar. Da minha parte, não tenho dúvidas que ficamos com ideias mais claras e com intenções mais bem definidas para o trabalho difícil, exigente e muitas vezes esgotante, como muitos colegas disseram hoje durante este webinar, na partilha que fizeram no chat, para garantir que os nossos alunos aprendam, e aprendam bem e aprendam o máximo possível. Muito obrigado a todas e a todos.